the most mysterious queen in history, as told in the Quran, the woman who entered the life of Suleyman alayhissalam. But first, we must ask one question. Who was Bilqis really? Was she human, or was she half Jinn? A prophet who commanded the Jinn and whose death was hidden until Allah revealed it. Did he really marry a Jinn? What do the Islamic sources actually say about this? And did Suleyman alayhissalam himself ever face this suspicion? There are astonishing things about this queen who ruled a kingdom stretching from southern Arabia to Africa. Are you ready to witness how a queen who prostrated to the sun gave up her throne, her people, and her false beliefs to submit to Allah? The story begins with a tiny bird, Hudhud, but in the end, it changes an entire empire. You are watching Religious Story TV. If you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and support us by leaving a comment. If you are ready, let's begin. My Lord, forgive me and grant me a kingdom that no one after me will ever possess. Truly, you alone are the most generous giver. So we placed under his command the wind, blowing gently wherever he wished by his order, and every shaitan who built and dived, and others bound together in chains. Surah Sad 38:35-38. This story began thousands of years ago, when a tiny bird suddenly disappeared from an army. And if that bird had never vanished, one of the most mysterious meetings in history might never have taken place. Now let us turn back time. In Jerusalem, the army of Suleyman alayhissalam stood in formation for its morning inspection, just as it did every day. But this was no ordinary army. There were men, both cavalry and infantry. Standing beside them was an unseen force, the Jinn. What the enemy feared most were these invisible soldiers. They could throw fire and launch sudden attacks without being seen. The Quran describes this extraordinary army in a single verse. And gathered for Suleyman were his armies of Jinn, humans, and birds, and they were kept in perfect order. Surah An-Naml 27:17. The lions led the animal division, followed by many wild beasts. High above, falcons and hawks circled through the sky. And the intelligence officer of this winged army was a small but irreplaceable bird, the Hudhud, the Hoopoe. Its duty was simple but vital. It flew across distant lands, carefully observed everything it saw, then returned to report directly to its commander. According to narrations, it was also able to locate hidden sources of water during its scouting missions. That morning, as the army stood in formation, a strange whisper spread among the animals. Where is the Hudhud? No one could answer. As Prophet Suleyman alayhissalam approached, the whispers grew louder. Everyone knew that this disappearance would have consequences. As Suleyman alayhissalam prepared to make wudu, he learned that the army was facing a shortage of water. He immediately asked about the Hudhud. The Quran records his words, "Why do I not see the Hudhud, or is it among those who are absent?" Surah An-Naml 27:20. No one had an answer. No one knew where it had gone. A fearful silence spread throughout the camp. Then Suleyman alayhissalam spoke with greater seriousness. Either it will bring me a clear excuse, or I will punish it severely, or I will certainly execute it. Surah An-Naml 27:21. At first, these words may sound harsh, but this was not about anger. It was about responsibility. The duty given by Allah could not be neglected. Water and intelligence were essential for the army. If the Hudhud had truly abandoned its mission, it had to answer for it. But what if it had not? What if it had left to carry out a far greater mission that no one else knew about? The wind grew stronger across the camp, as if the air itself was warning that a storm was about to come. After a while, a small shadow appeared in the sky. It came closer and closer. The Hudhud was returning. But it was no longer the same bird that had left that morning. Its eyes had seen things no one else had seen. Its heart now carried a heavy burden, because the next sentence it spoke could either save its life or bring a death sentence upon it. And perhaps it was about to speak one of the bravest sentences in human history. No one breathed. The little bird slowly descended from the sky. It folded its wings. It had returned from a long journey. It was covered in dust. It was exhausted. But there was something in its eyes stronger than fear. What it knew was more valuable than its own life. Suleyman alayhissalam looked at it silently. The Hudhud raised its head and spoke the words that the Quran has preserved for centuries. I have learned something that you do not know. Surah An-Naml 27:22. What had the Hudhud really seen? This is where the true story begins. The Hudhud continued, I have come to you from Saba with certain news. Surah An-Naml 27:22. This was not a rumor. It was not gossip. The Hudhud had seen everything with its own eyes. Sulaiman alayhissalam did not interrupt. The Hudhud continued, I found a woman ruling over them. She has been given everything, and she possesses a magnificent throne. Surah An-Naml 27:23. A woman was ruling an entire kingdom. At that time, this was highly unusual. She possessed wealth, a powerful army, and a successful trading empire. Yet the Quran specifically draws attention to her throne. Why not her palace? Why not her army? Because Allah was about to place that throne at the very center of this story. Remember this detail, because very soon, that throne would become the first thing to break down the walls surrounding a queen's heart. The Hudhud had traveled to Saba. There it saw the entire population gathering and moving toward one place. It was a vast ceremonial ground. First came the soldiers, then the commanders, then the royal advisors. Finally, a woman appeared, seated upon a magnificent throne, wearing a crown adorned with precious jewels. It was Queen Bilqis. The queen stepped down from her throne. She led her people forward. She raised her hands. Then the entire city, following the leadership of a single woman, bowed down before the sun. The Hudhud trembled. Subhanallah, it whispered to itself. These people have abandoned Allah and are worshipping the sun. It flew to another Hoopoe nearby and called out, O noble Hudhud, could you please tell me what is happening in this city? The reply was short but heavy. The people have come to see Queen Bilqis. They are performing their great ceremony of prostrating to the sun. The Hudhud watched everything throughout the day. It learned that the kingdom was called Saba, and its queen was named Bilqis. It also discovered that Bilqis was intelligent, powerful, and just. But how could such a wise woman bow before something that had itself been created, the sun? That question stirred a great storm inside the little bird's heart. It knew it had to report everything it had seen to its commander, Suleyman alayhissalam. But carrying this news was both a great responsibility and a great risk. The Hudhud spread its wings and began the long, exhausting journey that would last for days. Now it stood once again before Sulaiman alayhissalam. Delivering this message meant stepping onto a path from which there would be no return. The Hudhud took a deep breath. Now it came to the most important part of its report. I found her and her people prostrating to the sun instead of Allah. Shaitan has made their deeds appear attractive to them. Surah An-Naml 27:24. This was the real issue. Not power, not wealth, not politics. It was belief. Then the Hudhud spoke one of the most powerful declarations of Tawhid found in the Quran. They do not prostrate to Allah, who brings forth what is hidden in the heavens and the earth. Surah An-Naml 27:25. Notice something remarkable. These words were not spoken by a prophet, they were spoken by a bird. The Quran teaches us that if Allah wills, He can proclaim the truth, even through the voice of a tiny bird. The Hudhud fell silent. It had said everything it needed to say. Now, every eye turned towards Suleyman alayhissalam. The prophets never judged a report the moment they heard it. Suleyman alayhissalam was about to demonstrate one of the greatest principles of justice taught in the Quran. We shall see whether you have spoken the truth or whether you are among the liars. Surah An-Naml 27:27. He did not reject the report. He did not accept it. First, he chose to investigate. This is true justice. He also wanted to hear the other side. So he decided to send a letter. But what did that letter contain? And why did Bilqis realize the moment she read it that it had not come from an ordinary king? Even though Suleyman alayhissalam commanded one of the most powerful armies on earth, his goal was to win hearts before conquering lands. He understood jihad better than anyone because he was one of the prophets. Suleyman alayhissalam sealed the letter with his royal seal and handed it to the Hudhud. The Quran describes this moment in a single sentence. Take this letter of mine and deliver it to them, then withdraw from them and observe how they respond. Surah An-Naml 27:28. The Hudhud gently took the letter in its beak. For a brief moment, it looked at the face of Suleyman alayhissalam. Then it spread its wings and rose into the sky. Once again, it flew across the endless deserts. But this time, it carried more than just a letter. It carried the destiny of an entire nation. Days later, Saba appeared once again, its golden palaces, its lush gardens, its busy caravan routes. Everything looked exactly as before, but this time, the Hudhud had not returned merely to observe. The Hudhud carried the sealed letter in its beak and returned to the land of Saba. It landed on a tree in the palace garden. When it noticed the room with the largest balcony, it understood that it belonged to the queen. It quietly slipped through the open window and hid behind an ornament near the ceiling. Looking down, it saw the queen asleep in her bed. Her hair rested across her pillow. Her face was more beautiful than the little bird had ever imagined. A strange sadness filled the Hudhud's heart. How can a woman blessed with such beauty, wealth and power, it thought, still worship the sun? Then another thought crossed its mind. If Sulayman's army fights these people, the outcome is certain. The queen is powerful, but she cannot stand against the army of Suleyman alayhissalam. The Hudhud hesitated. Should I leave the letter now, or wait until she wakes up? But while thinking, it became distracted for just a moment. The letter slipped from its beak and landed directly on the queen's bed. At that very moment, destiny took over, because this tiny accident would change the life of a mighty queen forever. When Bilqis opened her eyes, she found a sealed letter lying before her. She quickly looked around. No one was there. With fear and curiosity, she opened it and began to read. This is from Suleyman. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, I invite you to believe in the one Allah. Do not act arrogantly toward me. Come to me in submission. The queen's anger rose at once. She searched the room, trying to find whoever had delivered the letter. But no one was there. She immediately called for her guards. Who dared enter my chamber? The guards were stunned. Their swords had never left their hands. They had remained on watch the entire time. They swore that no one had entered. So how had this letter reached the most heavily guarded room in the palace without anyone seeing it? That question would shake not only the guards, but the entire kingdom. To find the answer, Bilqis would soon have to make one of the most important decisions in history. Whispers began spreading through the palace corridors. Servants exchanged worried glances. Guards tightened their grip on their swords. No one could explain the mystery. As Bilqis stared at the sealed letter in her hands, she felt something changing deep inside her. It no longer seemed like a simple threat. It felt as though it had opened the door to a world she had never known. She could not sleep that night. The next morning, still troubled, she called an emergency meeting of her royal council. Standing before them, she raised the letter and spoke. "O chiefs, a noble letter has been delivered to me. It is from Suleyman. It begins, 'In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate.' He commands me not to be arrogant toward him, but to come to him in submission. What do you advise?" Then she spoke the words preserved in the Quran. "O chiefs, give me your opinion in this matter. I never decide anything until you are present with me." Surah An-Naml 27:32. Silence filled the hall. Then angry voices began to rise. One advisor stood up. "So King Sulayman demands our surrender. This is a declaration of war. Then let us fight." Most of the council agreed. The Quran records their reply. "We possess great strength and mighty warriors, but the decision is yours. Consider what you will command." Surah An-Naml 27:33. After a long silence, Bilqis finally answered, "When kings enter a land, they ruin it, and they humiliate its honored people. That is what they always do." Surah An-Naml 27:34. Then the queen made her decision. "I will send them a gift, and then I will wait to see what my messengers bring back." Surah An-Naml 27:35. No one objected. The council accepted her plan. But the queen did not know that every single word spoken in that meeting had been overheard by a tiny bird hiding above them near the ceiling. The moment the council ended, the Hudhud spread its wings and flew away. It had another message to deliver to Suleyman alayhissalam. But would Bilqis's gift satisfy him? Or would it become the beginning of an even greater conflict between two mighty kingdoms? Everyone in the palace was asking the same question. Some believed the gift would prevent war. Others believed that a king as extraordinary as Suleyman could never be satisfied with gold and precious jewels. Even Bilqis herself looked at the magnificent gifts being prepared and quietly wondered, would they truly be enough? As the messengers departed, the queen stood watching them until they disappeared beyond the horizon. A long caravan set out, traveling north toward the palace of Suleyman alayhissalam. The camels carried chests filled with gold, precious jewels, rare perfumes, the finest fabrics, and every treasure that represented the greatness of the kingdom of Saba. But the messengers leading the caravan knew they were carrying something far more valuable than gold. They were carrying their queen's question. Who is Suleyman, really? At last, Jerusalem appeared on the horizon. Soon they would stand before one of the most powerful rulers on earth, but as they approached the city gates, they saw something they had never expected. This city was unlike any kingdom they had ever visited. There were guards, there were soldiers, but there was something else. High above, birds flew in perfect formation, as though they were obeying invisible commands. Even from a distance, the city displayed a discipline beyond human understanding. The Quran had already revealed the reason. Allah had given Suleyman alayhissalam authority not only over people, but also over the Jinn and the birds. This was not his own power. It was a blessing from his Lord. The messengers exchanged silent glances. Finally, one of them whispered, "Our queen is about to witness far more than she has ever heard." The great palace gates slowly opened. The messengers were welcomed inside. The magnificent hall before them looked nothing like anything in Saba. It was breathtaking, yet it had not been built merely to impress. There was greatness, But there was no arrogance. There was silence, but there was no fear. It felt as though the center of this palace was not a king, but the peace that Allah had placed there. They walked through the hall until they finally stood before Suleyman alayhissalam. The messengers bowed respectfully. One by one, the gifts were uncovered. Gold, rubies, emeralds, exquisite jewels. The palace servants carefully arranged them before the king. Perhaps no ruler in history had ever refused such wealth. The messengers watched Suleyman alayhissalam closely, because this was Bilqis's true test. Would his eyes light up at the sight of gold? Would he become excited? Would he begin negotiating? None of it happened. Suleyman alayhissalam looked at the gifts. Then he turned toward the messengers. The Quran records his unforgettable reply. Do you offer me wealth? What Allah has given me is far better than what He has given you. Surah An-Naml 27:36. Silence filled the hall. The messengers looked at one another. Every ruler they had ever known always wanted more. This man wanted nothing. Suleyman alayhissalam continued, No, it is you who rejoice in your gift. Surah An-Naml 27:36. Such a short sentence, yet so powerful. At that very moment, Bilqis's test had been answered. She simply did not know it yet. The messengers continued listening. This time, Suleyman alayhissalam spoke with greater authority. The Quran says, Return to them. We will surely come against them with armies they cannot resist, and we will drive them out in humiliation. Surah An-Naml 27:37. Notice the order. First, he rejected the gold. Then he spoke these words. The message was clear. The truth is not for sale. The messengers left the palace without saying a word. The same treasure chests they had carried into Jerusalem now traveled back with them. Days later, the gates of the palace of Saba opened once again. Bilqis was waiting for her messengers. The moment she saw their faces, she knew the gifts had been rejected. But what caught her attention even more was the look in their eyes. It seemed they had witnessed more than just a king. They had experienced something far greater. Bilqis quietly asked, Tell me everything. As they spoke, she listened carefully. She wanted to see Suleyman alayhissalam with her own eyes. She wanted to speak with him herself, because this king had built a kingdom unlike any other. It held unseen realities and signs that could not be explained by ordinary human power. Her heart had already begun to change. She felt both fear and deep admiration. More than anything else, she could not forget one thing. He had refused all her gifts. She had to meet him herself. But while Bilqis was preparing for her journey, Suleyman alayhissalam was also making preparations. At that very moment in Jerusalem, he was about to give an order that would begin one of the greatest miracles mentioned in the Quran. He said, O chiefs, which of you can bring me her throne before they come to me in submission? Surah An-Naml 27:38. A deep silence filled the hall. Bilqis's throne was inside the most heavily guarded part of the palace in Saba. It was hundreds of kilometers away, protected by guards. The queen herself had not even arrived yet. How could such a thing be possible? Then a powerful voice rose from among the gathering. A mighty Ifrit from the Jinn stepped forward. The Quran records his words. I will bring it to you before you rise from your place. I am certainly strong enough and trustworthy. Surah An-Naml 27:39. The people in the hall looked at one another. The Ifrit spoke with complete confidence. Think about it. Bilqis's throne was in Yemen. Suleyman alayhissalam was in Jerusalem. Hundreds of kilometers separated them. Yet the Ifrit said, I can bring it before this meeting ends. Even that was astonishing. Most people probably thought, nothing could possibly be faster than that, but Allah was about to surprise everyone. Then the Quran introduced another man. Many books of Tafsir identify him as Asif ibn Barkhiya. The Quran simply says, one who had knowledge from the book said, I will bring it to you before your glance returns to you. Surah An-Naml 27:40. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. The Ifrit had said, before this meeting ends. This man said, before you can blink. This was completely beyond human ability. The Quran does not explain how it happened. It simply tells us that it happened. This verse is also a powerful answer to those who claim that only prophets can receive extraordinary miracles from Allah, and that righteous servants can never be granted karamat by His permission. The Quran itself presents an extraordinary event performed through one who had knowledge from the book by the permission of Allah. Then the Quran says, when Suleyman saw the throne placed before him, he said, this is by the favor of my Lord, to test me whether I will be grateful or ungrateful. Whoever is grateful, it is only for his own benefit. And whoever is ungrateful, then surely my Lord is self-sufficient and most generous. Surah An-Naml 27:40. Here we see one of the greatest differences between the prophets and ordinary kings. Another ruler might have used such a miracle to glorify himself, but Suleyman alayhissalam immediately remembered his Lord. Because he knew that miracles never belong to the servant, they belong entirely to Allah. But the story was far from over. In reality, it was only beginning, because bringing the throne was not Suleyman alayhissalam's final goal. He slowly walked toward it. He placed his hand upon it. Then he turned to his attendants. The Quran records a single command: alter her throne for her. Surah An-Naml 27:41. Everyone was puzzled. Why? If the throne had already been brought, why change it? What was Suleyman alayhissalam trying to test? And how would this small change become the first step in the greatest transformation of Bilqis's life? Now the story was about to reach an entirely new level. By the command of Suleyman alayhissalam, the throne was carefully altered, just enough to make Queen Bilqis hesitate when she saw it. Because Suleyman alayhissalam was not trying to hide the throne, he was trying to awaken a heart. Meanwhile, Bilqis was drawing closer to Jerusalem. The queen was silent. She had barely spoken during the entire journey. Perhaps for the first time in her life, the world she had always believed in was beginning to crumble. When the walls of Jerusalem came into view, the caravan slowed down. The city gates opened. Bilqis took a deep breath. At last, she whispered, I am about to meet him. The great palace doors opened. Bilqis was invited inside. The corridors were silent. The beauty of the palace did not feel like luxury for its own sake. It reflected order. With every step she took, her curiosity grew stronger. Finally, she entered the grand audience hall. Directly before her stood a magnificent throne. As she walked forward, she suddenly slowed down. Her heart began to race. She stared at it without blinking. No, that cannot be possible. It cannot be. It only looks like it, but it looks exactly like it. Bilqis took a few more careful steps. Everyone in the palace watched her. No one spoke. Then Suleyman alayhissalam broke the silence. He asked only one question. The Quran says, Is your throne like this? Surah An-Naml 27:42. Notice how gentle this question is. He did not say, This is your throne. He did not say, Look, I brought your throne here. Because the truth is never forced upon someone. A person should recognize it with their own heart. Bilqis looked at the throne again. She walked around it. She examined every detail. Her face showed complete astonishment, but something even more remarkable could be seen. There was no pride. Many rulers would have denied it immediately. Instead, she gave the beautiful answer preserved in the Quran. It seems to be the same. Surah An-Naml 27:42. It seems. That single phrase reveals her character, because she truly did not know for certain. She did not pretend to know what she did not know. Real knowledge sometimes begins with the courage to say, I am not sure. Suleyman alayhissalam said nothing, because another door had already opened inside Bilqis's mind. Each event raised an even greater question than the one before. But the throne was not the final test. Bilqis was still searching for answers. Suleyman alayhissalam knew that, so he invited her into another part of the palace. Bilqis walked forward slowly. At the end of the corridor, a brilliant light appeared. At first glance, it looked as though the floor was covered with water. She stopped. Her heart raced once again, because the next step she took would change not only what she saw, but also what she believed. The water appeared so clear that the stones beneath it could be seen. Light reflected across its surface. Gentle waves seemed to move before her eyes. From the other side of the hall, Sulaiman alayhissalam quietly watched. He did not rush her. He did not explain anything. He simply waited, because a truth discovered with one's own eyes leaves a deeper mark than one explained by someone else. The Quran describes the scene with remarkable simplicity. She was told, "Enter the palace." Surah An-Naml 27:44. Bilqis thought to herself, if I step forward, my clothes will get wet. She gently lifted the edge of her garment and began to walk. Then the Quran says, when she saw it, she thought it was deep water and uncovered her legs. Surah An-Naml 27:44. At that moment, Suleyman alayhissalam broke the silence. It is a palace paved with transparent glass. Surah An-Naml 27:44. Bilqis froze. She looked down again. There was no water. The floor beneath her was crystal clear glass. What she had thought were waves were only reflections of light. What she believed would soak her feet was nothing more than a perfectly smooth floor. This was the very scene with which we began this story. But now it carried a completely different meaning. This was not simply an astonishing display of architecture. Allah was teaching Bilqis a profound lesson. Sometimes even our own eyes can deceive us. If that is true, then how certain can we be about the beliefs we have carried in our hearts for years? A moment ago, she believed she saw water, but there was no water. So what if the beliefs she had trusted for so many years were also mistaken? At that moment, the final wall inside Bilqis's heart began to crack. Over the centuries, many stories have been told about this scene. Some claimed Suleyman wanted to see her feet. Others claimed her mother was a jinn. Others claimed there was something unusual about her legs. But we must be very careful. The Quran says none of these things. Some later books of Tafsir and historical works mention various reports about Bilqis's physical appearance. Many scholars have classified these reports as Israeliyat, and they are not confirmed by either the Quran or authentic hadith. For that reason, they should not be presented as established historical fact. Allah knows best. Bilqis could no longer speak. The letter, the rejected gifts, the throne, and now the crystal floor. One after another, each sign was dismantling the worldview she had held for so many years. Sometimes Allah guides a person's heart, not through a single miracle, but through many clear signs that arrive one after another. Bilqis was beginning to understand. The man standing before her was not merely a powerful king, he was a prophet supported by Allah. But one final sentence still remained, the most important sentence of all. And the Quran would place those words on Bilqis's own tongue. One sentence would leave her entire past behind. One sentence would become an example of submission until the day of judgment. Bilqis took a deep breath. "My Lord," she paused. Perhaps these were the hardest words she had ever spoken, because for the very first time she was calling upon her true Lord. Then she continued, "My Lord, I have truly wronged myself." Surah An-Naml 27:44. This is where true guidance begins. The very first thing she said was, "I have wronged myself." Real repentance begins exactly like this. A person first looks honestly at themselves. They admit their own mistake. They do not blame their ancestors. They do not blame society. They do not blame the people around them. They say, "The fault is mine," because Allah had placed countless signs before them. Yet they had failed to recognize them. Then Bilqis spoke perhaps the most important sentence in the entire story. The Quran says, "And I submit, together with Suleyman, to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds." Surah An-Naml 27:44. Read this verse carefully. Bilqis did not say, "I submit to Suleyman." No, because prophets never call people to themselves. They call people to Allah. That is why she said, "Together with Suleyman," meaning, "I submit to the same Allah, whom he worships and to whom he invited me." But for many people, the story does not end here. In fact, this is where new questions begin. For centuries, people have asked the same things. What happened to Bilqis afterward? Did she return to Saba? Did she continue ruling her kingdom? Did Suleyman alayhissalam really marry her, or were those stories added later? Here, the Quran becomes silent, and where the Quran is silent, later narrations begin to speak. But which of those narrations are reliable, which are Israeliyat, which can be accepted, and which should be treated with caution? The Quran is not a history encyclopedia. The Quran is a book of guidance. Allah tells us what we need to know, not everything we are curious about. Keep this idea in mind, because we are about to see something important. Years passed. Scholars, historians, and Mufassirun began collecting the reports that reached them about Bilqis. Some said Bilqis returned to her land. Others said, no, she stayed in Jerusalem. Some said Sulaiman alayhissalam married her. Others said no such marriage happened, she was a Jinn. At first, a person may not know which report to believe, but there is a very important principle here. Ibn Kathir, Tabari, and other classical Mufassirun included many of these reports in their works, but they did not always present them as certain truth, because in early Tafsir books, especially in reports about past nations, there are also narrations known as Israeliyat. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us a measure in this matter. If reports from the people of the book are confirmed by the Quran and authentic Sunnah, we accept them. If they clearly contradict them, we reject them. But if they are neither confirmed nor rejected, we do not give a final judgment. We say, Allah knows best. A large part of the reports about the rest of Bilqis's life falls into this category. Some Islamic reports are very similar to a story found in the Aramaic commentary of the Book of Esther from the Old Testament. In that text, it is said that Bilqis's mother was a fairy and her father was a Jinn. According to this book, Bilqis had hair on her legs. It says that Sulaiman alayhissalam wanted to test whether this claim was true. So he had the courtyard of his palace covered with a crystal floor, with water flowing beneath it. When Bilqis entered the palace, she thought she would walk through water and lifted her dress. Then it was seen that her legs were not hairy. But here there is a serious question. Suleyman alayhissalam had the power to command the Jinn. So how could he not know whether someone was human or Jinn? This part of the story clearly raises a major problem, and this section of that book conflicts with what we know from Islam. This book is generally accepted to have been written after the rise of Islam. Because its story is so similar to Islamic narrations, some scholars understand it as having been influenced by the Quran. So even if some events in the book are told correctly, Islamic scholars accept that legendary additions were also made. The most unusual version of the story of Sulaiman alayhissalam and the Queen of Saba appears in the Ethiopian legend called Kebra Nagast, meaning the glory of the kings. According to this legend, the Queen of Saba was named Makeda. She married Suleyman, and the Ethiopian dynasty began with their son, Menelik I. But based on historical documents, it is not possible to prove the exact identity of Bilqis. In the written records of the Kingdom of Israel from the time of Suleyman, or in the records of neighboring lands from the same period, no clear person matching her is found. However, in the annals of the Assyrian kings Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, 3 Arab queens are mentioned. Their names are Zabibi, Samsi, and Tal-Hum. From this, it is understood that female rulership may have been known among some Arab peoples. Among the ancient Near Eastern states, female rulers were limited in number. Yet these 3 women ruled in the same cultural world and in dates close to one another. The Sabaeans were an Arab people who lived in what is now Yemen. So what can be said is this: Bilqis may have been an Arab queen who lived around the 10th century before Christ, at the same time as Suleyman alayhissalam. But it is not possible to say with certainty whether the Arab people she ruled were the Sabaeans or the Manaeans who lived in that same region before them. Because according to the archaeological records we currently have, the history of the Sabaean state does not clearly go back earlier than the 8th century before Christ. Before that state was established, the Manaeans lived in the region of Saba. Their history goes back to around the middle of the 2nd millennium before Christ. Based on the available records, it is not possible to determine with certainty when the Manaeans ended and when the Sabaeans began. Now we must stop and ask ourselves a question. Why did Allah not tell us about the rest of Bilqis's life? Because the main point was not how many years she lived. The main point was the moment her heart changed. The Quran tells us about transformation, not every detail that came after it. Because in the sight of Allah, the greatest victory is not conquering a land. It is the turning of a heart from shirk to Tawhid. That is where the story of Bilqis is completed. But human curiosity does not end there. In fact, an even greater question begins. For centuries, one question has been asked again and again. Why did Allah choose a bird? Pause for a moment and look at the story from the beginning. One of the most powerful prophets in the world had people under his command. He had the Jinn, he had the wind, he had a massive army. If he had wanted, he could have surrounded Saba with a single command. If he had wanted, he could have filled the sky with his armies. If he had wanted, he could have reached the palace of Bilqis before she even read the letter. But Allah did not choose any of those ways. Instead, he chose a tiny bird. Why? Because this story is not the story of power. It is the story of guidance. Think about the Hudhud. It was not strong. It was not large. People would not take it seriously. Perhaps the people of Saba did not even notice it as anything more than an ordinary bird. But Allah began the first step that would change the course of history through its wings. This is the vision of the Quran. If Allah wills, He makes a prophet a means. If He wills, He makes a shepherd a means. If He wills, He makes a child a means. And if He wills, He makes a tiny bird a means. Because greatness is not in the means. Greatness belongs to the one who gives guidance. Today, we often fall into the same mistake. Who am I? How can something I say change anyone? I am only an ordinary person. Maybe the Hudhud could have thought the same way. I am only a bird. There are others greater than me. This is not my responsibility. But it did not say that. It did not hide the truth it had seen. It flew, it spoke, it fulfilled its duty. Then it left the result to Allah. This is the essence of dawah. You are not responsible for the result. You are responsible for delivering the truth. Notice another detail. When the Hudhud saw Saba, it did not immediately pass judgment. First, it observed. The words of the Quran show this. First, it saw the queen. Then it saw the throne. Then it saw the people. Then it noticed what they were prostrating to. In other words, first it looked, then it understood. Only after that did it speak. What a powerful lesson. Today, many people speak without looking. They judge without investigating, yet even the tiny Hudhud first searched for the truth. There is another subtle point. When the Hudhud came to Suleyman alayhissalam, it said, "I have learned something that you do not know." Surah An-Naml 27:22. At first, this sentence sounds very bold, but pay attention. The Hudhud was not praising itself. It did not say, "I know more than you." No, it was simply reporting a matter that Allah had shown it. This is true knowledge. A person sees what they know as a favor from Allah, not as a proof of their own superiority. Now let us look at Suleyman alayhissalam. A ruler listened to a tiny bird. He did not interrupt it. He did not belittle it. He did not immediately say, "I know better than you." Instead, he listened. Then he investigated. Then he decided. This is true leadership. As a person's rank grows, their ears should not become smaller. Perhaps this is why Allah revealed this story not only for Bilqis, but also for leaders. Now let us return to Bilqis. When Allah guided her, what did He do? He did not change her heart all at once. First, He sent a report, then a letter, then a test, then a miracle, then a question, then a glass floor. Each step completed the one before it. This is one of the ways of Allah. Most of the time, hearts do not change all at once. They change step by step. Keep this thought in your heart, because perhaps even today, Allah has been preparing such a journey inside your own heart for years. And here, we reach the deepest question of the story. In reality, the greatest obstacle before Bilqis was not the sun. It was not the throne. It was not her kingdom. It was her own heart. Because breaking the idols outside a person is easy. The real difficulty is breaking the idols inside the heart. And in the next part, we will see why the story of Bilqis is actually the story of our own lives. Because this is not only the story of a queen who lived thousands of years ago. Perhaps it is my story. Perhaps it is your story. For a moment, forget Bilqis, forget Saba, forget the throne, forget the glass palace, and ask yourself one question. Have you ever discovered that something you thought was true was actually false? Maybe it was an idea you believed for years. Maybe it was a person you trusted. Maybe it was a goal you spent your life chasing. Then one day you realized that all of it had been taking you away from the truth. This is exactly what happened to Bilqis. But her mistake was not just about an idea. It was not just about a lifestyle. She was mistaken about her Lord. When the Quran tells us the story of Bilqis, it is actually holding a mirror in front of us, because every person has a sun in their life. The sun of Bilqis was in the sky. Our sun is sometimes in our pocket, sometimes it is our career, sometimes it is our status, sometimes it is the things we do only so people will praise us, and sometimes it is our own nafs. The shirk described in the Quran is not only bowing before idols made of stone. Whatever a person places before Allah in their heart, that becomes their greatest test. That is why the story of Bilqis never becomes old. People change, cities change, civilizations change. But the test of the heart does not change. Today, Very few people may bow down to the sun, but hearts still bow to money. They bow to fame. They bow to the nafs. They bow to the approval of people. This is what the Quran makes us think about. Perhaps the greatest miracle in the story of Bilqis was not the throne. It was not the glass palace. It was not even the Hudhud. The greatest miracle was that a human being was able to say, "I was wrong," because this is the hardest sentence for the nafs to say. Firaun could not say it. Namrud could not say it. Karun could not say it. But Bilqis said it. What made her eternal in the Quran was not that she was a queen. It was that she was able to humble herself before the truth. Did you notice something? Allah does not describe her wealth in detail. He does not describe her army in detail. He does not tell us how many cities she ruled. The Quran tells us only what we need to know, because in the sight of Allah, what gives a person value is not what they possess. It is the direction of their heart. Perhaps this is why the names of many kings were forgotten in the Quran. But this woman, whose name is not even directly mentioned, entered verses that will be recited until the Day of Judgment. What an honor! Suleyman alayhissalam never said to Bilqis, "Believe in me." He never said, "Follow me." He only invited her to Allah, because this is the shared mission of all prophets. They do not call people to themselves, they call people to Allah. Even today, this is the measure of a true caller. It is not to make people admire you, it is to make them love Allah. And the Hudhud was perhaps the quietest hero of the story. It simply fulfilled its duty. Maybe it never even witnessed the moment Bilqis believed. But its small mission changed the destiny of a nation. This gives us great hope. Maybe one ayah you share, one word you say, one video you post, may, by the permission of Allah, become a means of guidance for another person. You do not need to know the result. The Hudhud did not know it either. It simply flew. Then it left the rest to Allah. And now, as we end this journey, let us remember the final message the Quran leaves with us. Because the story of Bilqis ends here, but the question it leaves behind will remain until the Day of Judgment. When the truth comes to you, what will you do? O Allah, make our hearts among the hearts that do not become arrogant when they see the truth. Grant us a heart like Bilqis, a heart that can submit when the evidence becomes clear. Grant us the courage of the Hudhud to deliver the truth. Grant us the wisdom of Suleyman alayhissalam to invite others with hikmah. And grant us the sincerity of Bilqis to say, when we must, "My Lord, I have truly wronged myself." Revive our hearts with the Quran. Do not let us turn away from the straight path, and take our final breath upon Iman. Amin.